On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm John Wilson, your moderator for this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Marc Lynch is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, where he is the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and of the Project on Middle East Political Science. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and edits the Middle East channel for foreignpolicy.com. In addition, he is the co-director of the Blogs and Bullets project at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Lynch publishes frequently on the politics of the Middle East, with a particular focus on information technology and political communication, Islamist movements, and the international politics of the region. Marc began writing his influential Middle East blog, Abu Aardvark, under a pseudonym in 2002 and began blogging under his own name in the spring of 2005. Despite or perhaps because of the quirky name, Abu Aardvark gained a wide following among Middle East policy professionals, journalists, and academics. In 2009, Abu Aardvark moved to foreignpolicy.com, and in 2010, Marc launched the Middle East Channel. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Marc Lynch.
All right, thank you for that introduction. So I was reminded as I was rushing up here by Josh that so I was here 2 years ago, and my book had just come out on the Arab uprisings. And just give me a minute just to reflect about the differences between now and then. And in a sense, you know, if you follow the daily headlines, it's still the same, I think, level of uncertainty, of chaos, of kind of this onrush of events that every day you're trying to keep up. But there's a big difference now. I think 2 years ago, when I was like waking up in the morning and trying to keep track of what's going on in the Middle East and trying to figure out what to think about it, what to say about it, what to do about it, there was this overwhelming sense of hope, right? There was this notion that there was this unstoppable momentum for change, and that, you know, even though everything was difficult and daunting and nobody thought that it was going to be resolved overnight, there was this sense that we were working towards something that was going to be better than the way things had been before. And today, you know, quite honestly, you wake up in the morning and you're confronted with this unending litany of despair and destruction, and whether it's Egypt and the military coup and just the deep depression that I feel when I look at what's happened to a country that I love, or Syria, where every day there's another atrocity being reported, another massacre, another pile of dead children. It's hard to wake up in the morning and confront this. And I think for a lot of people, so the title that we gave for this was After the Arab Spring, a title I dislike and I like for different reasons, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I think that there's this sense of, you know, things are just really bad right now, and I feel it. Everybody who follows the region feels it, and anybody who doesn't feel despair when they look at the region right now, I think just isn't looking closely enough. At the same time, I still feel, and I feel this quite profoundly, that if you widen the lens and you look at where we are today compared to where we were, say, 20 years ago, rather than compared to where we were 2 years ago, you'll have a much more hopeful feeling about what's happening in the region. Because I really do think that fundamental changes have taken place, not all good, some of them quite bad, but overall, there's no going back to a situation in the region which was really quite bad. If you go back and you think about the way things were 20 years ago in much of the Middle East, you were looking at a region where almost every country in the region was ruled by a stifling autocracy of some kind. Sometimes they were extreme totalitarian regimes like in Libya or Syria or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. Others, they were less extreme but still extremely repressive, places like Egypt or Kuwait. But there was no place in the region that you could look at least not in the Arab world, where you could say that there was anything which was meaningfully democratic, pluralistic, and in fact, even in the less extremely repressive places, what you would see was the ability of states to control their societies in fundamental ways. The states had the upper hand. The states were able to dominate, to control, and to crush anybody who tried to challenge them. It was almost impossible for a citizen to get access even to the most basic information about what was happening in their own countries. They couldn't get access to basic news. States owned the television stations, states controlled the media, and unless you were one of the privileged elites, the people who were able to travel to the West or staying in luxury hotels, you didn't have access to the most basic kinds of information, even to the extent of being able to form an opinion. And if you did form an opinion, these societies were largely controlled and dominated by security services, by pervasive intelligence apparatuses, which made it extraordinarily dangerous for anyone to speak up about their dissatisfaction or about their dissent. And, there obviously were dissidents who did do that, and many of them paid the ultimate price. Many of them were killed, many of them were tortured, many of them were driven into exile, many of them suffered extreme depredations for their courage, but they were the exception to the rule. It was extraordinarily difficult for anybody to challenge the kind of autocracy that you saw in an Iraq or a Syria or a Jordan back then, 20 years ago, and extraordinarily difficult for us to imagine any kind of change, to understand that anything could even potentially be different about the region. Quite honestly, at a certain point, I was almost ready to give up studying the Middle East because things were so boring. I mean, we don't usually think about the Middle East as boring, right? But in a sense, there was this sense of stifling repetitiveness about many of whether it's the Arab-Israeli conflict or authoritarianism in the region or the Iranian nuclear issue. It just seemed like the same things over and over and over again. And so that's 20 years ago. Now, the things that I studied, though, a lot of my academic work is on, as John said, is on information technology, on communications, and a lot of the things that seemed to actually start changing way, way, way before 2011. And so where a lot of my colleagues saw a region that was largely stable, largely static, all through the 2000s, I saw something very different. What I saw over the course of the 2000s was the beginning of some really fundamental changes taking place, not at the level of revolutions, not at the level of democracy. That was still a pipe dream. I didn't see that coming. But what I did see happening was that over the course of a decade, you began to see the media changing, people changing, information technology changing in ways that was clearly beginning to fundamentally undermine the power of these states and of these regimes. And if you go back and you look in the 2000s, this is when you have Al Jazeera starting to broadcast, new satellite television stations that basically shattered the ability of regimes to control the news. So it used to be that if there was a protest on the street in Cairo, nobody would even know about it. By 2003, 50 people could go out on a street corner and start holding up signs. Al Jazeera would broadcast it to the entire Arab world and to millions of Egyptians, and that gave a real power to those protesters that they never had before. Then you layer onto that the internet, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all of these new kinds of communications technologies. And what you end up with by the time you get into the mid to late 2000s is, over the course of less than a decade, societies that go from information black holes to utterly saturated in information. And so you go from not being able to know anything about your own societies to knowing everything about your own societies. And that's profoundly destabilizing. And it's masked by actions on the ground. So any of you who were paying attention to Egypt back in the 2000s, I'm sure many of you were, you would know that there was protests taking place on almost a daily basis in Egypt by the time you get to the second half of the 2000s, the decade of the 2000s. There are people protesting, whether they're laborers and workers engaging in strikes, whether it's journalists, whether it's students, university professors, lawyers, judges. There's protests going on everywhere in Egypt all through that decade. And so what I was seeing over the course of the 2000s was not this kind of stifling conformity and nothing ever changes. What I was seeing was this rising tide of protest, increasing access to information, real transformation at the social level. At the same time, you're having these growing and really unmissable economic changes that are taking place. You're seeing, again, in places like Egypt, these policies of privatization and these things which were clearly wiping out the middle class, a formerly fairly stable and prosperous middle class in places like Jordan or Egypt, are being utterly wiped out by there's this growing inequality, growing gap between the rich and the poor, and then this real unmistakable decline in social services, state services, and the basic institutions of the state. What you have by the end of the 2000s then is, on the one hand, people are saturated with information, but they're struggling to make ends meet. Populations are increasingly educated, they're ambitious, and there's no jobs. I mean, there's something like 60% real youth unemployment in a place like Egypt, at a time when education is higher than it's ever been before, and information technology is more open and free than it's ever been before. And at the same time, because you're getting this privatization and this foreign direct investment pouring in, the economy seems to be doing great, but what's really happening is a very small class of very wealthy and very articulate and very well-connected people are living the good life, right? I mean, it's extremely conspicuous. One of my favorite images that I have from Egypt on a trip I took shortly before the revolution was right next to Mbaba. There's this Mbaba was one of the worst slums in Cairo. There's this enormous, beautiful hotel complex high-rise that goes up right next to it. And a friend of mine, a photographer named Musab Lashami, he won an award for this photo where he just stood there and he snapped this picture. And there's a line. I mean, it couldn't be any more stark. Beautiful, shining hotel. The streets are clean and recently paved. There's no garbage anywhere. And right next door, buildings are falling apart. The road is pockmarked. There's garbage everywhere. And it's like, no, he didn't filter it. He didn't doctor it. That was how stark this difference was. So anyway, my point in all of this is to say that if you take a slightly longer view, things like the Egyptian Revolution didn't come from nowhere. They came from a process of transformation that was taking place over the course of a decade. But still, most of us thought that the regimes were strong enough to survive. That basically, they had been facing problems like this for a long time, and they always seemed to find a way to survive. Every challenge, they seemed to beat back. Every time it looked like protesters had momentum, they would find a way to survive. And that's why we were taken by surprise by Tunisia in 2011, in January of 2011. Now, when the uprising breaks out in Tunisia, again, I just want to emphasize this was nothing new. You get these kinds of protests breaking out in the south of Tunisia every few years. And usually what happens is people go on a rampage, they burn up some police cars, they burn down some government buildings, security forces come, knock it all down, and they go back to normal. And then, of course, what happens in January of 2011 is that instead, this one doesn't get stopped. It spreads to the capital, people occupy the main street, and the army refuses to open fire, and President Ben Ali ends up fleeing the country, and you get a real revolution. It's a very short version of a complex story, but it's good enough for now. This took almost everybody by surprise. Not that there was protest. Protest was nothing new. What was surprising was that the protesters actually won. And this was revolutionary. Now, this was being heavily covered all over the region. Everybody's covering it. It's on Al Jazeera. It's all over the blogs. It's all over Twitter. It's all over Facebook. And almost instantly, everybody around the region is starting to look at this, and they're saying, why can't we be next? If Tunisia can do it, why can't we do it? Now, you've got to understand that there's always been this very strong collective Arab identity, this sense of shared fate, the sense of shared, this shared struggle, shared issues. This was felt profoundly in January of 2011. I mean, Yemenis, you cannot get farther away from Tunisia within the Arab world than Yemen, but Yemenis were looking at Tunisia and they were inspired by it. Egyptians were inspired by it. Syrians were inspired by it. Everybody is looking at this, and for the first time, everybody was sort of thinking, you know what? We can win. this can actually happen. The military didn't come in and murder everybody. The president did run away. Protests were peaceful. They were sustained long enough to succeed, and you ended up with a transition. And this was really quite inspiring. Now, Egypt, 11 days after Ben Ali falls, you get the Egyptian uprising. And once again, it was nothing new to have Egyptians in the streets protesting. That's old news. That happens all the time. What was new was that on January 25th, instead of 10,000 people showing up, 1 million people show up, and they simply overwhelm the security forces. It takes a few days, but they seize Tahrir Square, they occupy it, and again, to make a very complex story much less complicated, the military refuses to open fire. That means that Mubarak cannot retake Tahrir Square, and after 18 days, Mubarak disappears. He doesn't run away, but he might as well have. And so now, what do we have? Two examples of two of the strongest, most long-lasting dictatorships in the Arab world. The exact same script plays out. Popular uprising, setting up a camp, the military refuses to open fire, the president's gone. So now you get this fever that seizes the entire Arab world. And this is actually why I do think that there was something unique that we can call the Arab Spring. This moment, January, February into March of 2011, there was an absolute fever that grips the Arab world. And everybody thought that the same script was going to play out, again, in place after place after place. People rise up, military refuses to open fire, there's a complicated political dance, and then the leader's gone. And people really believed that this was inevitable at this point. It actually kind of makes me cry now to go back and read some of the things that Syrians were saying at the time. Because at the time, Syrians thought the same thing. When Bashar al-Assad comes out and gives his first speech, everyone is laughing about it. They're saying, oh, hey, there's speech number one. Ben Ali gave 3 speeches and then he left. And Mubarak gave 3 speeches and he left. So Assad's got 2 speeches to go. And it sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it didn't feel ridiculous. At the time, there was this overwhelming sense of the possibility and even the inevitability of change. Now, that idea pretty much comes to a crashing halt by about middle to the end of March of 2011. And that's when a whole series of the protests go off in a different direction. So in Yemen, you get, it turns really bloody. Government snipers shoot a bunch of university students in the head at Sana'a University. The military splits, and you get this really nasty, protracted standoff. In Bahrain, the security forces, assisted by the Saudis, come in and they crush the uprising, they bulldoze the Pearl Roundabout, they arrest a whole bunch of people, and basically succeed in stopping, at least for temporarily, a protest that had half of the population of the country in the streets protesting. But they crush it. And this basically tells people that actually victory is not inevitable. And then in Libya, things had gotten violent and bloody right from the start in February, but it was right around the exact same time that the NATO jets start bombing, and this turns into a war. And it's right around the exact same time that Syria, the Syrian protests really get going, and they're immediately met with really brutal, violent force. And again, what you're getting is, instead of this obvious, easy script of popular, peaceful protest, military doesn't open fire, you get change. Instead, what you're now getting is stalemate, bloodshed, failure. And it takes there's a lot more examples I could give, but I really want to get to the current situation. I just want to say that basically the Arab Spring, as people know it, I think was a real thing. It lasted for about 2 months, 2.5 months, and then it ended. And what we've had since is a series of national political struggles that have taken a number of different forms. Very few of them have gone particularly well, but not all of them. They're not as interconnected as they once were. When we get to the Q&A part, I want to keep this short and take your questions and talk about what you care about. But I will say that so I'm happy to kind of go country by country and talk about any of those cases you want to talk about. But I would say that right now there's only two countries in the region that you can kind of tell a reasonably happy story about. Tunisia, where the first one that had its revolution, and where they've gone to the brink several times, and yet they've managed to pull themselves back. They managed to get a constitution. They've managed to get a caretaker government. And Tunisia, once again, it's possible to feel somewhat optimistic about. And oddly enough, Yemen, where despite the fact that you have a secessionist movement waging open war against the government in the south, and another secessionist, or maybe not secessionist, but another regionally based movement in the north also engaged in open warfare against the central government. And despite that, you actually have had a national dialogue that has come to a seemingly somewhat successful conclusion, and some hope that you might move towards elections. And again, it's a tenuous hope. When Yemen's your best example, you know you're reaching. But still, Yemen and Tunisia, you can see some hope. I'm one of the few people out there who still thinks that Libya is a place where there's still some real hope. I think that they've struggled because they've been unable to establish what we political scientists call a Weberian state. They don't have a monopoly over the means of violence, which means that these militias are out there basically preventing the government from establishing authority. But there's still hope, I think, for Libya. In fact, I'm actually somewhat bullish on all of North Africa. I actually think that Morocco is in an evolutionary path, whether the king wants it to be or not. I think that Tunisia has a chance. Libya has a chance. Morocco and Algeria is just defying the odds, and I think it's actually heading towards something different. But North Africa in general, I'm somewhat optimistic about. In the Gulf, I actually think the Gulf is set for either a lot better times or a lot worse times, depending on how you define better and worse. In other words, I think that there have been much more sustained and meaningful protest movements in the Gulf than most people recognize. I think if you look at Kuwait, it's had some of the most important, sustained, and politically significant protests that Kuwait has ever had, and it's actually caused real political change. In Oman, there's real political change coming, whether people want there to be or not, because the Sultan is very old and sick, and he has no heir, and it's the most mobilized the population's ever been. Saudi Arabia is far less stable than people think it is. It has, right now, despite the fact that it still has an extremely draconian state, it also has what is arguably the most wired population in the world. It has the highest per capita consumption of YouTube videos of any country in the world. Basically, the entire country is on Twitter now. And it's a society where there's one of the most profound mismatches between public state control of formal politics and this rising dissatisfaction and rising challenge from the popular level. It actually doesn't look all that different from Egypt in the late 2000s in that sense. Despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is quite wealthy, it also has really quite shocking levels of poverty for a country that's that wealthy, something that people are asking lots of questions about these days. There's no jobs. And right now, the main solution for Saudi Arabia for its youth problem has been to give them all scholarships to come and study in the West. There's hundreds of thousands of young Saudis, probably more than that, studying in the West on scholarships right now, which quite frankly is one of the best things King Abdullah has ever done. It's a wonderful program, but those Saudis want to go home. They're going to want jobs, and some of them might even want to drive cars. And some of the women who are highly successful, brilliant women, I've met so many of them, who are coming and they're getting professional degrees. And so basically my point in all of this is simply to say that North Africa seems to be kind of doing its thing. The Gulf, I think, is heading for some rough times, if you define non-rough as political stability. And then that leaves us with the Levant, the center of the Middle East. And there, I'm nigh apocalyptic on the center. And that's what I want to spend my last 15 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes talking about, is the core countries in the center of the Middle East, Egypt and Syria being the most important. And both of them are on an extremely negative trajectory. They have been for quite some time. The problems are a little bit different from each other, or they're very different from each other for now at least. But in each case, you see this really frustration of what had once been, I think, a real hope for change. Let me start with Egypt. In Egypt, I think what you had was something, and again, I was more optimistic about Egypt. I think last time I was here, I was quite optimistic about Egypt. And I stayed optimistic about Egypt even when a lot of other people had given up hope. And I think nobody would disagree that the transition after Mubarak, which began in February of 2011, was spectacularly mismanaged at every level. I mean, it's hard to find a political player in Egypt which didn't contribute to this slowly unfolding political fiasco, which was the Egyptian transition. The military made bad decisions. The Muslim Brotherhood made bad decisions. Secular activists made bad decisions. Everybody made bad decisions. It was like a comedy show a lot of the time. Just, people could only throw up their hands and laugh when they would see the things that people would do. And yet, there was a political momentum going forward all the way up through last summer, where despite everything, you would have these series of elections. You would have these ongoing protests, which would demonstrate the ongoing vitality of the street and of civil society. You would have just this sense of like lurching from one crisis to another, but it was still lurching forward. You would have the elections to a parliament, which unfortunately then got dissolved by the Constitutional Court. That was bad. And you had the elections to the presidency, which produced the worst possible outcome: a runoff between between a major Muslim Brotherhood figure, Mohammed al-Morsi, and the symbolic representative of the former regime, Ahmed Shafiq, which basically was the worst possible runoff election because neither one of them represented more than a quarter of the population. In the first round, when there were multiple candidates running, that's what you got, was 25% for each of them, and then a solid 50% of the vote split among people who we could call revolutionary candidates. And none of those revolutionary candidates made it into the second round of the elections. So basically, you had a runoff between the Muslim Brotherhood, which has its base of about 25%, and a lot of people disliked, feared, and mistrusted, and the old regime, which, they just had a revolution to get rid of, and a lot of people didn't want back. And so you get the presidential election, which results in an extremely narrow win for the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, 51-48. And this was, again, not because 51% of the people really liked the Muslim Brotherhood. It was because 25% liked the Muslim Brotherhood and 26% hated the old regime. And that managed to add up to a Muslim Brotherhood presidency. The Muslim Brotherhood was disastrous in power. They were unable to cooperate with anyone. They scared everyone around them. They ruled unilaterally, and when they did try to reach out to people, nobody would cooperate with them. And so basically, you ended up with Mohammed al-Morsi, despite being an elected president, proving unable to govern. Economies collapsing, political societies uniting against him. The youth are frustrated, the workers are frustrated, everybody's frustrated, and Morsi is just plowing along. On June 30th of last year, you get this national day of protest that was called by this Tamarud movement, this youth movement with the assistance, it turns out, of the Egyptian military and security services and lots of other people. And this was actually, in my estimation, potentially a very good thing. And I think in the estimation of a lot of people who participated, a very good thing. Because basically you had millions of people, not 33 million, that's ridiculous. You see that in the media. There weren't 33 million people in the streets. That didn't happen. But there were millions of people in the street coming out in a peaceful protest against Morsi, which could have been an extremely positive development, showing that the street is still alive, showing that Mohammed al-Morsi could not rule unilaterally, and providing real energy and momentum heading into new parliamentary elections, which could have led to the appearance, for the first time in modern Egyptian history, of a balance of power between two elected institutions, an elected president and an elected parliament. That would have been a very good outcome, except that 4 days later, the military stepped in, overthrew Morsi, and basically wiped out all of the democratic institutions, abolished the Constitution, and then rounded up and arrested the senior leadership and then the middle leadership, and then lots of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And after about a month and a half after this happens, they decide to move in militarily against this sit-in, this protest site that the Brotherhood had set up in Rabat. And they wiped them out with brutal force. It was considerably bloodier than your average day in Syria or Libya or Iraq. Something in the ballpark of 800 to 850 people were killed that we know about. And then people start getting arrested and rounded up. And this then turns into what we have today in Egypt, which is this highly xenophobic, highly nationalistic military regime, which has criminalized dissent and which has imprisoned not just the Muslim Brotherhood on grounds of terrorism, but basically almost every independent voice in the country. Some very close friends of mine who were leading secular activists, like Ahmed Maher of the April 6th movement, Ala Abdel Fattah, who was one of the leading leftist revolutionary socialist activists, journalists like Mohammed Fahmy, who, trust me, doesn't have a Muslim Brotherhood bone in his body, even though he worked for Al Jazeera. They're being rounded up, thrown in jail, held without trial, and basically you've had the criminalization of dissent. And that leaves Egypt now in a very dangerous place because General Sisi, who's the military head of Egypt, is pretty clear that he's then going to run for president, and it's pretty clear that whoever opposes him is going to become a terrorist. And this is the old Mubarak handbook, and I think we're heading right back to it. And so, if you look at Egypt right now, you have a situation then where the military is about to directly rule, something that they spectacularly failed at for all of 2011. So you could say, okay, fine. We didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was not a good group of guys. They were doing things we didn't like. At least we're going to go back to stability. At least we're going to go back. Al-Sisi can actually just restore stability to Egypt. It's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is that the country remains profoundly polarized and highly politicized. And there is this deep, restless discontent with everybody in Egypt. And the economy continues to be a disaster. Tourism is dead. The only thing keeping the Egyptian economy afloat right now is that every few months, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait pump another $4 to $6 billion in to the central bank to prop up the currency. Doesn't create any jobs, doesn't create any economic reform that's necessary. And all it does is push the can down the road another couple of months. What does this mean? It means that once General Sisi is the new president of Egypt, popularly elected president of Egypt, 6 months later, the economy is still going to be a disaster. He's going to be unable to fix any of the problems. And the Muslim Brotherhood that he likes to blame all of his problems on, they're all still in jail. What do you think is going to happen? People are going to go back to the streets because this is not the Egypt of the 1980s or the 1970s. This is an extremely mobilized, politicized, and polarized public, which is perfectly happy to mobilize against anyone. And so basically what Egypt is heading towards, in my opinion, is a long period of instability, of polarization. And this is the part that really kind of makes me want to cry, is that the main way out of this kind of situation would be what? Through elections. Have elections and be able to restore legitimate electoral rule. Except that now, after a military coup, nobody believes in democracy anymore. Nobody in the opposition believes that if they're elected, they're actually going to be able to rule because we now see what happens. You have the so-called popular impeachment, which leads to a military coup. And so how could anybody trust in the validity of elections? What's more, the coup was legitimated with this overt rejection of the principle of democracy, that just because Morsi won the election doesn't give him the right to govern. And so now we're in a situation where all of the likely escape valves for Egypt have been shut off. The military is directly ruling. They have nobody else to blame. And none of the problems of Egyptian society have been solved. And so when I look at Egypt right now, I see something which is heading not towards this kind of roadmap to democracy that you hear about, but heading towards something which is potentially even uglier than what we've seen for the last few years. So Egypt, not giving me a lot of hope. But it looks like positively rosy compared to Syria. Because Syria, as you know, started off as this peaceful uprising of almost unbelievably courageous youth. I mean, the courage that it took to go out into the streets in January, February, March of 2011 in a place like Bashar al-Assad's Syria just beggars belief. I mean, this is a country where people were routinely killed, tortured, and horrible things done to them for even the slightest, tamest public dissidence. And yet they risked their lives, they risked their families' lives, they risked their village's existence to go out and protest. And again, I think they were very much swept up by this early Arab Spring fever, this notion that they should take these risks because they thought they could win. Bashar responded with military force very quickly and attacked them, killed them, and then the hopes began to change a bit. Now the hope was, well, the West will intervene in Syria like it did in Libya. Because in Libya, the same thing happened. And so if our peaceful uprising won't succeed, then maybe we can just attract international intervention. And I would say that for the year of 2011 and into early 2012, this was the big dynamic of what you saw there. Kind of these extraordinarily tenacious, nonviolent protesters who were basically suffering under these constant attacks from the regime, but refused to be cowed, while mobilizing international public opinion and campaigning to try and get a Security Council resolution authorizing intervention, campaigning to try and get International Criminal Court indictments, campaigning to try and get the West and the Arab states to work together. And they had quite a bit of success getting Arab League support, Arab Summit support, and kind of symbolic sanctions like that. They got all the way to the Security Council. I was sitting there in the chamber when Susan Rice tried to bring it to a vote, but they failed. They didn't get the Security Council resolution. They got a double veto from Russia and China, and that road was blocked. After that, you begin to get quite rapidly a shift from nonviolent protest into an insurgency, which was fueled and supported from the outside, mostly from Gulf states and from Turkey, where you begin getting guns and money being poured into armed factions, and the nonviolent, peaceful protesters who are watching. I mean, let's be real about what's happening here. They're watching their villages, their towns, their neighborhoods being destroyed. And it doesn't look like anyone's coming to help them. A lot of these people decide to pick up guns, pick up arms. And again, people who look at this and say, well, this was just Al-Qaeda from the start are just wrong. I mean, that's not what happened. What happened was that it goes from this nonviolent uprising into this mix between nonviolent protest and insurgency. And then, unfortunately, quite predictably, this external support did what almost always happens when you get external arming of insurgencies. It proved to be just enough to make sure that the rebels could seize a significant amount of territory and begin to protect it, but not enough to actually overthrow Bashar. Bashar's allies, Russia and Iran, pour support into him. Hezbollah intervenes at a certain point to contribute to the fighting, and you end up with a stalemate. Where Bashar and his forces control the parts of the major cities and key parts of the country. I'd say probably about 30 to 35% of the territory, but probably like 60 to 65% of the population. And the rebels, they can't really control because they're far too internally divided and fragmented to control anything, but they can deny the regime control over probably 60 to 70% of the territory of the country, and they're too strong to be defeated. Some of you probably follow, I certainly follow on a daily basis, the ups and downs. The rebels are advancing. There's battles in Aleppo. There's defections from the regime. The Syrian opposition council falls apart. It's all interesting at a certain level. For people like me, it's like our lifeblood, but really most of it is insignificant. Basically, there's been, for the last year and a half, roughly, a military stalemate in Syria, and nothing has really changed it. And basically, as those battle lines have hardened, you've gotten this incredibly increasing toll on the civilian population, as you've gotten the barrel bombs, the chemical weapons attacks, All of these things are in response to the military stalemate, where Assad can't win, but he also can't lose. And so the violence goes up, extremism goes up. It gave that point of entry for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda type organizations to get their point of entry and to sweep in and to displace some of the more moderate or more secular parts of the insurgency. But again, this is what happens when you have a protracted insurgency. Nothing that's happened in Syria surprises me in the least, because back when I was arguing against arming the insurgents back in late 2011, early 2012, that's what I was warning about, is if you arm the insurgents, this is what you're going to get: a protracted stalemate, extraordinarily bloody, and no resolution in sight, which is where we are now. I think we're looking in Syria at a war that's probably going to go on for at least another 5 to 7 years, with Assad falling only being a milestone along the way, because even when he falls, and I do think he's going to fall, all that's going to happen is a weak transitional government will be put in his place, and the insurgency will continue. Maybe the current regime supporters will become an insurgency fighting from the other side, while the Al-Qaeda types will continue their insurgency against a Western-backed transitional government on the other side. And that's the geopolitics of it. But the cost of it is almost unbelievable. The amount of devastation and destruction which has been wrought on Syria as a country and on the Syrian people just absolutely beggars belief. It's beyond what happened to Iraq in the 2000s. You have, the number of dead doesn't really tell you what you need to know. So you'll see things like 150,000 dead. That doesn't really tell you very much. I mean, a lot of the people who are dead are combatants, and especially since early 2012, the balance between civilians and combatants being killed has gone much more towards the combatant level. That's not the number that matters. The number that really matters is the displacement and the refugees, where you have something in the ballpark of 2 million refugees and something in the ballpark of another 6 million internally displaced, probably more. Nobody really has the ability or apparently the interest in counting. Where you have basically entire cities and villages that have been utterly destroyed. I don't know if you saw the New York Times story a couple days ago, it might even have been yesterday, on the UN report on the targeting of children. And what's so horrible about this is that a report comes out and says that 11,000 children were intentionally targeted, raped, murdered, killed, and everyone shrugs, because that's what we expect now, because we already knew this about Syria. And we are looking at a situation where an entire generation has been destroyed, an entire generation that's been displaced, an entire generation that has known nothing but devastation, displacement, and war, and you don't put that back together. You look at what's happening in Iraq right now, and yeah, part of it is the destabilization, the spillover from Syria, but part of it is the fact that Iraq was never put back together again. You don't put a country that's gone through that kind of sectarian civil war back together again in 6 months or a year. And so what happened in Iraq over the 2000s is the same thing that's happening in Syria right now. Is going to be a gaping hole in the heart of the Middle East for a very long time to come. A lot of people ask, I'm sure like half of those note cards ask, well, does that mean the United States should intervene? Does that mean the United States should do something? And look, I supported the intervention in Libya because I thought it could succeed, and it did. And I've opposed an American intervention in Syria from the start because I didn't think it could succeed, and I still don't. I don't think the United States militarily can accomplish its goals with anything short of a full-scale invasion and occupation. Having studied Iraq as long as I do, I don't even think that would solve it. I think that would get rid of Bashar quite quickly, and then we'd be there stuck for the next decade trying to control the remnants. But we could do it with a full-scale military intervention. But everything else that's on offer, the arming of the rebels, bombing, airstrikes, carving out no-fly zones, I don't see any of those actually ending the conflict. I only see them as getting us deeply involved in the conflict, which will continue to rage, and then drawing us down into that direct intervention, which I think the September debate over the chemical weapons issue, I think showed pretty clearly that almost nobody in the United States has any appetite for. And so, if I had thought from the beginning that the U.S. could have done good by intervening, I would have supported it. But I never thought that. I still don't think that. And I think that kind of leaves us kind of where we are, which is you identify Syria as a tragedy, And it is a genuine tragedy, and yet you find yourself helpless to do anything about it, which actually kind of captures how we feel about the entire region right now. So I've gone on a little bit too long, and I do want to leave you with some sign of hope. And so let me just say that if we manage to get a real, genuine nuclear deal with Iran and manage to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then that will probably have some minor spillover effects on the rest of the region. And so, so there's something to hold on to. Should I sit or should I stay up here? Or?
That's fine.
Okay.
We have as many questions as I think there are cross currents in the region on many, many different topics. But I want to start with just a really simple one, and that is you talk about the impact of social media and Al Jazeera. Is censorship prevalent? And are there firewalls in Egypt and these other countries that prevent social media from, being effective, or are those firewalls just easily surmounted?
There's some of that, but the way they actually do it is a bit different. Basically, what you've had is a cat and mouse game. As activists kind of make these advances and they catch regimes flat-footed, and then the regimes catch up. So the way that the regimes have dealt with social media and with the broadcast media has been to kind of find ways to work with it and bend it to their advantage. So like Bahrain pioneered this, where they were having a real problem with Twitter and forums and Facebook. So what they did was they basically got a whole bunch of people to go and form pro-regime accounts and go and flood those social media sites with pro-regime messages, or to really nastily attack, to troll people who said anything in favor of the opposition. And within a few months, they had managed to turn basically Twitter into an unusable space for talking about Bahrain. They couldn't censor it, so they simply made it unusable. In Egypt right now, you have like Al Jazeera has been utterly demonized. Egyptians hate Al Jazeera now because they identify it with the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's this relentless propaganda campaign against it. Instead, you have local channels, and the local channels have, kind of a surface diversity, but all of them basically now are parroting the regime's point of view and spewing out propaganda in favor of the coup and against the Muslim Brotherhood. And most Egyptians, despite all the social media stuff, most Egyptians still get their news from Egyptian TV, especially with Al Jazeera having been discredited and marginalized. And there's variations on this all along. But it is interesting, though. If you look at a place like Saudi Arabia, there is nothing that they would like more than to shut Twitter down and not have to deal with it anymore, but they can't. Half the population is on it, and including a number of members of the royal family. They're all out there, and some of them are lurking and watching to see what people are saying about them. I think that the symbol of this for me is this utterly absurd trend which has swept the Gulf and now apparently is moving into Egypt, which is criminalizing insulting of the king or of the emir, of the president. So basically you're having people getting arrested because they made a joke about the emir on Twitter. And think about how insecure you have to be to go and arrest somebody because he called you fat on Twitter. That's what's happening. That does not show regimes that are confident and in charge. It shows regimes that are flailing around and really worried about these things. So there's a variety of ways they've tried to deal with it. They recognize it's out there. They recognize they can't stop it, so they try and find ways to blunt it.
Why has Tunisia been able to navigate this transition and establish a more successful regime?
It's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people looked at Tunisia and they think that they made some of the right decisions, like they had the way they structured their constitutional process and the like. If I had to narrow it down to two things, it would be that the Islamists in Tunisia were smarter. Rashid Ghannouchi, who's like the overall head of the Ennahda party in Tunisia. People have all kinds of problems with him, but he lived in exile for 15, 20 years, and he's sophisticated, and he understands a lot of the problems in ways. I mean, talking to him versus talking to leaders of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, it's like you're in a different universe, conceptually and intellectually. And I think that helped them a lot. He was willing to step back and not dominate, to form coalitions, to try and reassure. On the other side, Tunisia, as a legacy of the Ben Ali regime, actually had a very strong labor movement, a strong secular left, which meant that forces were more balanced. So maybe Ghannouchi wanted to dominate just as much as the Brotherhood did. I don't think he did, but maybe he did, but he couldn't because he actually had strong opposition. Whereas in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood looked around and they were like, why should we compromise with anybody? Everybody else sucks. I mean, they're all so weak, they can't even win a seat in parliament. Why should we give them a position in the government? And in Tunisia, they didn't have that luxury. They knew that they had to compromise. This could all still fall apart. Tunisia's economy is still a disaster, and polarization is still high, and there's no guarantees in Tunisia, but they have done better, and I think that's why.
When you look at Egypt, beyond the two primary factions, do you see others or other individual leaders in particular coming to the fore or getting stronger and developing a real following?
I can't really see any other particular leaders. Most of the people who might emerge as such leaders have either been compromised or driven from the country. I mean, like Wael Ghanem, the creator of the We Are Khaled Said Facebook page, is living in Dubai. A lot of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, as I said, are in jail. It doesn't really seem to be anybody who can emerge as an alternative. But on the other hand, I think the thing I was trying to emphasize about Egypt and where we're going is that General Assisi knows that he is at any moment, kind of one traffic accident away from the streets filling up with protesters again. I mean, he lives in fear of popular mobilization and of the street. And I think you see his heavy-handed efforts to mobilize support and the praise of the military. And don't get me wrong, there is genuine, passionate enthusiasm for the military in Egypt right now. I mean, it's not all manufactured. I mean, it's this really passionate support and hatred of all of these designated enemies, but it's fickle. And he knows that. And so I don't see any particular alternative leader emerging. There's nobody who you can say, Hamdin Sabahi or Abdul Fattah or Amr Musa or whoever, not Amr Musa. But you can't look at these guys and say, this is who the next leader is going to be. What you can say is that the military is a very, very far distance away from actually reestablishing any kind of stability or any kind of real political roadmap. And it leads not towards Sisi being replaced with someone else. It leads towards, like I was saying, chronic turbulence and instability, which is going to continue to drive investors away, going to continue to drive tourists away, and that vicious cycle.
You've done a remarkable job in covering a myriad of countries in a short period of time. I don't think you commented on Jordan.
Oh, Jordan. I love Jordan. I lived there for many years, and it's a country that is basically always on the brink of collapsing but never does. And I think that they have been pretty good at surviving in very difficult times. These are very difficult times. I mean, they still have hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees living in the country that have been absorbed. Now they have this enormous influx of Syrian refugees. I mean, the refugee camp in northern Jordan, Nazatri, is according to the Jordanian foreign minister, when I asked him about it, he said it's now the third largest city in Jordan. What you'll read in the media is that it's the fourth largest. He said it's actually the third. And these people aren't going home anytime soon. And that puts an enormous strain on water, on economic resources. Now, Jordan is very good at using this to extract international support and get UNHCR help and UNRWA support, but it's nowhere near enough. I think that what keeps Jordan from actually having an uprising, and I think what blunted, because there was real mobilization in Jordan back in 2011, really unprecedented levels of youth mobilization, not just in the capital, not just among Palestinians, but down into the tribal south. But I think what pulls people back is that, unlike, say, Egyptians, who kind of looked at Mubarak and said anything would be better than this, now Jordanians, they looked at Iraq, they looked at Lebanon, they looked at Syria, they look at Palestine under Israeli occupation, and they say things could be a lot worse. And I think that's what keeps people, loyal to the king. Not any great love for the king, but this deep set recognition that things could get a lot worse. And I think that has a restraining, retardant effect on mobilization in Jordan. I think that's also kicking in across the rest of the region. That's one of the knockoff effects of Syria and also of Egypt's failure is, Egyptians are just exhausted. These years of turbulence, this sense that any change is going to be better, nobody has that anymore. And so if you're, say, a Saudi leader or an Algerian leader, your best argument now is not, I'm a good leader, it's, do you want to be like Syria? And that's a persuasive argument for a lot of people. Say, you know what, I used to think I wanted change, but now, look at this. Do I want that?
The other notable omission, Morocco.
Oh, Morocco. Well, Morocco, kind of the same thing, except in a slightly different way. I actually think that the King of Morocco actually he got out in front of the protests more effectively than I think any other Arab leader. And I have to give him some credit on that. Now, what he offered was not any meaningful democratization or any meaningful power sharing or pluralism, but he got out early. He didn't have to wait to be dragged kicking and screaming to this. He saw what was happening around the region. He saw the protesters in the streets, and he made a preemptive offer of constitutional reforms, which was enough to divide the opposition, to take the steam out of the protest. He lets the major Islamist party win the elections and take over the prime ministry, which has no real power, but it's enough to kind of keep them in the game, in the system, and that basically broke the back of the protest movement. And so basically, I think what you see in Morocco is a case of someone who actually saw what was happening and reacted and responded effectively enough to survive, which, in this environment is really all you need to do. If you didn't fall in like those first couple months, you're likely to still be on the throne today.
You commented on the public's, disdain or distrust of Al Jazeera in Egypt. What about Al Jazeera elsewhere in the region?
I think Al Jazeera, it's kind of a sad story because what basically happened over the course of the Arab uprisings is that, this is just my opinion on this, is that the Emir of Qatar, who had basically previously had something of a hands-off policy towards Al Jazeera, just let it go out there and make him famous, he suddenly saw how useful it was, and he started using it as a political weapon. Libya was where this really, really became clear, where he basically turned Al Jazeera into a cheerleader for the Libyan uprising, and then 10 times that in Syria, where basically it's just this unending, kind of basically propaganda for the Syrian rebels. And right or wrong, whether or not that was the right thing to do, what it did was it undermined Al Jazeera's reputation for neutrality and independence, and it came to be seen as just another TV station. And one strongly aligned with Qatari foreign policy, which means that if you don't like Qatari foreign policy, you don't like Al Jazeera. And that, compared to what Al Jazeera was in the previous decade, when it was this kind of the neutral meeting ground for all of the political forces in the region, everybody would come there and argue and everybody would watch it. That's what he burned. And so he burned basically 13 years of political capital building on, a few months of political gain. And the architect of Al Jazeera's rise left after 6 months into the Arab uprisings. Wada Khanfar basically left. And then, of course, a year after that, the emir himself decided to take a vacation and put his son in control, which is something that Arab leaders just don't do, right? They never step down peacefully. And for him to hand off power to his son and then have his extremely powerful his extremely powerful prime minister / foreign minister sidelined and removed from his position as head of the Qatari National Investment Fund overnight suggests that there's something more going on there than just health concerns. So Qatar basically is a country where things happen very quickly, and Al Jazeera, you could almost see it as kind of a canary in the coal mine. One of the really, kind of depressing and ironic things about all of this is that, if you're Bashar al-Assad, you can now claim that you have now survived the Emir of Qatar. Who would have predicted that? It looks like the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, is in mortal political danger, and if he falls, which seems increasingly likely, then Assad will be able to claim the scalps of two of his most vocal and outspoken opponents, and that leaves only King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, who's not a spring chicken.
Where are the Palestinians in all of this in terms of their internal political process and governance?
Externally, the Palestinians kind of were in some sense, they were hurt the most by the Arab Spring in some ways because everyone stopped paying attention to them. They stopped being the center of Arab politics as the attention goes every place else. Egypt, Libya, Syria. And so the Palestinians, I think for arguably the first time in kind of modern Arab history, almost become marginal to what's going on. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still important, it still matters, and if there's another intifada there or a new war, trust me, it's going to refocus attention very, very quickly. But for a while there, they kind of fell out of the spotlight. Young Palestinians tried to mobilize along Arab Spring lines, and you saw like Palestinian youth using the same kinds of tools, social media, and trying to form, have their own hashtag and do protests and things like that. But it was very difficult to get momentum. Part of it is that you have the Palestinians are split between Gaza under Hamas rule and the West Bank under a combination of PA rule and Israeli occupation. It makes it very difficult for them to collaborate on anything meaningful politically. If you're protesting against the PA, then you're by default helping Hamas, right, in that kind of polarized environment. And then a lot of the protesters could never quite figure out whether they should be protesting against the Israeli occupation or against the Palestinian Authority. In other words, are you trying to enlist Abu Mazen as your ally in a peaceful uprising against Israel, or are you trying to mobilize against Abu Mazen and overthrow him in order to create a different, better, alternative kind of regime? And I think the Palestinians were hopelessly divided over that question. And then finally, it's just hard to have that kind of uprising when you're living under occupation. And so I think that kind of really blunted their efforts to try and mobilize. But now, kind of as things are starting to settle down, now you've got John Kerry out there trying to broker this peace agreement. Maybe he's going to offer a Kerry plan soon. Maybe it'll even succeed. I mean, it doesn't look likely, but anything's possible. But just kind of it's bring the spotlight back onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that it really hasn't been for quite some time.
This is a provocative question, but I have to ask it. Somebody submitted this one. Is it at all conceivable that there are opportunities for Israel to play a constructive role in all of these developments in the region?
Well, it depends on the constructive role in which kind. So, for example, they're already selectively intervening militarily in Syria. They've gone in and bombed several times, and whether that's constructive or not, leave it to that depends on whether you support that kind of action or not. But certainly what you're seeing now is something which has been evolving for at least a decade, but has never been more clear, that there's a de facto alliance between the Gulf states and Israel. They basically agree on almost everything in the region now. They think Iran is the greatest threat. They don't really care about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They're very unhappy with the United States and with the attempts to make peace with peace with Iran, and to not intervene in Syria. So you have a greater and more public meeting of the minds between the Gulf states and Israel than you've ever had before. Now, whether you think that's constructive or not is going to depend on whether you support what Israel and the Gulf states are trying to achieve or not. So constructive, I think, isn't exactly the right word. There's really fundamentally new ways that Israel is interacting with Arab states compared to the past. And it's one of the most notable features of kind of the regional international relations. I mean, you just had just a few days ago, you had a leading kind of semi-official Prince Turki Al Faisal, who doesn't have any official position in Saudi Arabia anymore, but still, he's very, very well connected, and he was out there publicly praising Livni and praising her efforts on various issues. And a year ago, That wouldn't have happened. 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable. And yet but now that's coming out into the public. Where that goes is anyone's guess, but I think that is something which is new, and people are still trying to wrap their heads around what it might mean.
Great. You know, I have probably another 90 minutes worth of questions here, and I really don't think I see anybody who's bored. So I would love to go on.
Give me the highlights. You're the boss.
But I think we do need to wrap up due to time constraints. This has been fascinating. This concludes our program for the evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Marc Lynch for his excellent discussion.